Okay, I think we're live. So let's go ahead and get started then. Good evening to all. My name is Amina Sharif, and I will be the chair for today's discussion with Dr. Megan Tinsley. So before I begin, I want to remind our viewers that this event was organized by MEND. MEND is a nonprofit company that helps to empower and encourage British Muslims within local communities to be more actively involved in British media and politics. And MEND has organized today's discussion as part of its broader annual campaign called Islamophobia Awareness Month. Islamophobia Awareness Month takes place every November, and it aims to do three things. One, raise awareness of Islamophobia. Two, encourage better reporting of hate incidences to the police. And three, highlight the contributions of Muslim communities to the UK. So with these objectives in mind, specifically the third objective of highlighting Muslim contributions to the UK, we've invited Dr. Megan Tinsley to discuss her first monograph, Commemorating Muslims in the First World War Centenary, Making Melancholia. Dr. Tinsley is a Presidential Fellow in the Department of Sociology at the University of Manchester. She received her PhD from Boston University in May 2018. She also holds a master's degree in race, ethnicity, and post-colonial studies from the London School of Economics, and a BA in international relations and French from Wellesley College. Dr. Megan Tinsley's current research engages with contesting statues, imperial nostalgia, and decolonizing the museum. So thank you, Dr. Tinsley, for being here today with us. It's absolutely an honor to have this conversation with you.
Thank you so much, Amina, and thank you to MEND for hosting me this evening. Really looking forward to this discussion about my forthcoming book, which will be published officially on Tuesday.
On Tuesday. Wow.
On Tuesday.
Okay, so
it's coming up soon. Yes, it's one of the last times that I'll be able to say my forthcoming book.
Yes. After that, it'll be a published book.
A published book. Yes.
Well,
yeah. Sorry, just go ahead.
Yeah. So this is a timely discussion then, and I turn it over to you to lead us into your book.
Okay. Thank you very much. What I think I'll do now is just provide a very brief overview of some of the arguments that I develop in the book. And I'm going to start with a bit of history. I am not a historian, I'm a sociologist, and many others have done this research well before I did, whether scholars or community historians or activists. And so the information that I'll present about the history of Muslims in the First World War isn't new. But I think it's important to lay out these details because we can't make sense of what's been forgotten or erased or remembered in new ways without beginning with what happened in the past. So I'll begin by saying that over the course of the First World War, from 1914 to 1918, Muslim soldiers and workers and civilians were pivotal to the British and French Empire's war effort. Britain was a naval power, and so in the early months of the war, it relied heavily on the Indian Army to wage war on the Western Front. In fact, during the first winter of the war, about 10% of Britain's forces on the Western Front were from undivided India. By the end of the war, 1.5 million soldiers from undivided India would serve on fronts in present-day Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Palestine, and Southern Africa. 400,000 of those soldiers were Muslim, and they came primarily from Punjab and the northwest frontier provinces in present-day Pakistan. Meanwhile, the French Empire relied heavily on the conscription of soldiers from North and West Africa to wage war. These were not troops that had been part of a professional army before the war, and the French state often used violence and coercion in recruitment. Throughout the war, this produced a fighting force of nearly 500,000 colonial troops, including 166,000 from West Africa, 140,000 from Algeria, 47,000 from Tunisia, and 24,300 from Morocco. They were joined by an additional 220,000 civilian workers from throughout the empire and China. In the armies of the British and French Empire alike, Muslims were disproportionately represented, overrepresented. And the reason for that was a martial racist ideology that depicted Muslims with racialized tropes, whether positive or negative. For example, French officials claimed that Morocco was the home to a so-called pure Islam, and that Moroccan soldiers were the best fighters. Conversely, they depicted West African soldiers, many of whom were also Muslim, as having a higher endurance for pain and hard labor. The consequences of these racist tropes were deadly. West African soldiers suffered a casualty rate 20% higher than soldiers from metropolitan France. And civilian workers from so-called non-martial races were dehumanized, treated as pack animals. So it's no wonder that about 10% of indigenous porters died during the war. And this was a casualty rate that was similar to soldiers on the Western Front. There was another reason that Muslims were important to the British and French empires, and that was because of how colonial officials understood the Ottoman Empire. Early in the war, a German diplomat named Max von Oppenheim had convinced the German Kaiser that the natural loyalty of all Muslims lay with the Ottoman Sultan, regardless of sect, ethnicity, politics, etc. And so under Oppenheim's guidance, the Kaiser persuaded Sultan Mehmed V to issue a fatwa against Britain and France. The German state believed that this would convince Muslim colonial subjects to rise up against their British and French occupiers and fight for the Central Powers. And so they launched a massive propaganda effort, dropping leaflets with the text of the fatwa into British and French trenches, segregating Muslim prisoners of war to try to convince them to defect, and even claiming that the Kaiser himself was Muslim. None of it worked. Only a handful of Muslim soldiers were recorded to have deserted the Central Powers. But the German propaganda campaign did have a significant effect on the British and French governments because they shared the belief that Muslims had a natural affinity for the Ottoman Empire. And so both of these empires tried to present themselves as Muslim powers. So they provided halal rations in the trenches, they embedded imams in Muslim regiments, encouraged soldiers to fast and to pray, and they adhered to religious law in burial practices. They carefully documented all of these efforts in propaganda postcards and distributed them to troops on the front. So what's interesting about this history is that Muslims were simultaneously valued for the power and prestige they brought to Britain and France, and they were valuable as soldiers during the war. They were also surveyed and scrutinized and racialized, viewed as potential enemies. All of these practices have left material traces in the archives and in cemeteries and even war memorials. But they're not part of how most people in Britain and France remember the First World War today. So part of my motivation in writing this book was to ask how this happened. How is it that histories are passively neglected and actively suppressed? How is it that they come to be remembered anew? And who decides? What does all of this tell us about Britain today and the nation that's being created by remembering the past? So the way that I approach these questions in my book is by looking at 11 sites of memory or acts of remembrance that center Muslims in the First World War. There are many others. This isn't an exhaustive study of sites of memory, but the ones that I've chosen reveal the incredible breadth of ways that people remember. I'd be happy to discuss all of them later in the session, but for now, I'll just introduce one of those sites, and that's the Woking Peace Garden in Surrey. It's a former Muslim burial ground from the two world wars. It was inaugurated in 1917 near the Shah Jahan Mosque, which was Britain's first purpose-built mosque. Soldiers who died at the Indian Hospital in Brighton Pavilion were buried there. And by the end of the war, it enclosed 19 graves, which rose to 27 by the end of the Second World War. It was maintained by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, but unlike many other cemeteries, it wasn't visited regularly by the families of the dead. In fact, only one soldier's widow lived in Britain. So instead, in the 1960s, it was repeatedly vandalized by far-right nationalists. Eventually, following an effort by Ethel Emma Wallace, who was the widow of Yusuf Ali, buried in the cemetery, all the graves were exhumed and they were moved to Brookwood Military Cemetery. And at that point, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission was no longer responsible for the site, so it decayed further. By the 1990s, National Front graffiti was clearly visible on the crumbling walls, and the ground was littered with used syringes. Most people in Woking at that point no longer remembered the site as a Muslim burial ground. But you wouldn't know that if you were to visit the site today, because since 2015, following 7 years of lobbying by a few determined individuals and funding from English Heritage and Woking Borough Council, the site has been restored and made into something new. It's been reimagined as a multicultural peace garden, combining its original walls with a new memorial stone, 27 Himalayan birch trees, rows of pink and white heather, a central water feature, and 2 stone prayer mats. The Woking Peace Garden uses the memory of Muslim soldiers to historicize contemporary multicultural Britain. And it's also a site for creating a nation. So its form is deliberately ambivalent, with a large open space that's well suited for prayer and contemplation as well as socials. Rather than recreating the site's original form, and far from claiming to revive its original purpose, Woking has drawn from the past to create something new, dynamic. And yet there's a caution here. When I spoke with Zafar Iqbal of Woking Borough Council, who was one of the key figures in restoring this site, he said something interesting. He said that before there was a sense of melancholy when you walked through the common, and I hope we haven't lost that. I think that's a very important observation because it tells us something about memory at large. The history of the Woking Peace Garden is a microcosm of the history of Muslims in Britain, and that includes imperial history. It includes war and violence, it includes neglect and forgetting, and deliberate erasure, and it includes something new and dynamic. But in its current form, the difficult part of that history, the neglect and erasure, is no longer visible. This is the dilemma that comes with remembering the past, and it's one that I don't have an easy answer to. I can only say that it's important to remember the past because it tells us about the present, but we should never be under the illusion that we understand the past in its entirety. There will always be human stories that contradict grand narratives. So we shouldn't be afraid to question heroes or national triumphs. Making sense of the present requires questioning the past in all of its messiness. So I'll leave it there on what I feel like is an uneasy note. So I'm looking forward to Amina's questions and to discussing some of the details of the book in more detail.
Thank you for that. That was really, really enriching. I made significant headway into your book, and I've read about half of it, and I had to read it twice just to really process what you've written. And I think hearing you speak some of the content of your book really helps to crystallize, the ideas that I was trying to make sense of over the past few days. I'm interested in this idea of the past and the future and the present, the past, the present, and the future. And you touched on that as your sort of final remarks in your brief presentation. That the past is a way of making the future, but at the same time, the way we remember is a construction that serves a political project of producing nation. Could you speak about that in terms of your work and and what that means within the context of remembering the centenary?
Absolutely, that's a really good question and a difficult question to think through. So why don't I start by talking about this duality that you highlight between past and future and what happens when we remember. So the way that sociologists understand memory is that it's separate from history. Memory doesn't tell us about the past, it tells us about the present. Because what we choose to remember, who we choose to remember, and how we choose to remember it reflects what we value in the present. And that's always power laden. So official rituals, state-led rituals, will legitimize the hold on power of people who already hold it. And so it's unsurprising that those in power will emphasize their own histories, stories that are relevant to them, and maybe stories of national triumph and glory and of being in the moral right, because all of this makes sense of the present and presents it in a favorable light. But that process is never complete either, because there are always buried stories, always counter memories, and so for every cenotaph, for example, there are letters, family letters, and they might tell stories of ancestors who opposed the war, who were fighting and who didn't understand what they were fighting for. They might tell difficult stories about war crimes or about desertion, stories that unpack this neat narrative of heroism. All of that is part of history, and all of those memories endure, even if they're not part of the official narratives. But who gets remembered and what gets remembered is a reflection of how we position ourselves in society. So that makes it really interesting when the dominant narrative changes. So for example, one question that I was interested in during the First World War centenary was whether Muslims would come to occupy more space in official commemorations. Would the imperial dimensions of the war be acknowledged in new ways? And if so, how would they be acknowledged and why? You know, why is it that they would be acknowledged in 2014 when they weren't in 1964, or less in 1964? So that, you know, that tells us something about the political moment of the centenary, and some of the rough edges of the present that memory sought to sharpen. So that's kind of a general overview of memory in general. And I'm trying. Did you ask me about the centenary specifically at the moment, or I can keep talking about that. But are you interested in in that particular moment, the centenary?
Oh no, that was excellent. I think before you go on, I'd like to pause at something that you said, which is obviously you went into this discussion on memory, and you offered this really, really important sociological conceptualization, and I sort of want to dig into that a little deeper. Because in your book you made a choice to privilege national memory as opposed to collective memory. So I think it'd be really useful for the audience to sort of get a sense of the difference between the two very generally. Tell us what national memory is. Tell us what it allowed you to do in your work that, you know, collective memory wouldn't necessarily have enabled.
Definitely. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. In memory studies, collective memory is the term that's more widely used. It's a useful term because it tells us that memory is social. We have our own individual recollections, but those are shaped by society, and they also contribute to larger memories. And those might map onto nations, they might map onto communities and cities, or institutions. All of these are parts of collective memory. So some scholars have critiqued the concept of collective memory because it applies a homogeneity that doesn't necessarily exist. So even though there might be an overall understanding of how the past happened, individuals will have differing understandings of that. And so sometimes that language of collective memory obscures that. The reason that I choose to use national memory is that for me, it emphasizes how the act of remembrance serves to create the nation in the present. And this links back to your question about the relationship between past and future. So in the act of remembering, we're creating the nation in the present. And when I say the nation, I'm thinking about a state. I'm thinking about hierarchies of power. I'm thinking about bordering practices that include some people while excluding others. And memory is a central part of that, collective memory and national memory. The act of remembering a war in a particular way differentiates the people who share that memory, who might belong to a particular nation, from those who remember the war differently. So as they say, the victors write the history, write the history books. So national memory creates national borders and creates a shared sense of a common history that binds together people who belong. And it also demarcates belonging from unbelonging there. So that is certainly in play in collective memory as well. But in referring to national memory, I'm trying to highlight the power laden dynamics of memory and the social construction of the nation in the process of remembrance, with all of the violence that entails.
Absolutely, and I think that was a beautiful, obviously, choice that you made, because you really wanted to move beyond memory as this sort of individual thing, but locate it within, you know, as you said, relations of power, hierarchies of being, and so on and so forth. So I was really interested in your book on the racialized nature of nation building. And you write that nationalism creates outsiders as it does, or it creates insiders, and then at the very same time, it creates outsiders. That the very nature of the border and defining sort of who belongs within it is entangled in the production process of defining who doesn't belong to it. So Can you talk more about the racialized character of remembering then, as it's producing nationhood in the present by looking backwards into the past? Who is it writing out, and how is that writing out happening in not just the making of history, but the making of Britishness today?
Yes.
Sorry, I don't know. Yeah, if that's okay.
That's a great question. My mind is going in multiple directions, but they're all really, it's a really interesting question that touches on a lot of important topics, I think. So first, just the racialized character of the nation, and by extension, the racialized character of memory. So as you pointed out, to create a sense of people who belong, a sense of insiders, that only carries meaning if insiders are distinguished from outsiders. And that seems to be an equal claim, that you might belong to one nation and not another. Fine, but what we know historically is that it didn't play out amongst equals. That Britain, and not Britain alone, but Britain among other imperial powers, created a sense of itself in opposition to its colonized subjects, colonized others. And so Britain as a nation, as four nations in one, was consolidated in opposition to colonial subjects. Whiteness was consolidated in opposition to blackness. And all of this played out through violence. There are a lot of really interesting examples of how this played out historically. So for example, N. Laura Stoller, who's a memory studies post-colonial scholar, writes about how etiquette, like Victorian etiquette, was constructed in the empire because these ideas developed amongst civil servants of what it meant to be white and British and civilized, in quotes, and it meant to distinguish yourself as much as possible from colonized subjects. So hence, very uncomfortable, very hot clothing in ill-fitting contexts, and also particular ideas about gender roles. Those developed in the empire, and then they were exported back to Britain. That's just one example, but it does go to show that sometimes in very violent, clear-cut ways, but also in embodied, intimate ways, the nation is constructed through creating difference. Now, in terms of how this plays out with memory, well, this is not how the nation in its dominant understanding likes to remember its own creation. We have other easier narratives of how nations came to be, and again, this is not unique to Britain at all. But what brings together citizens, people who belong? What are the shared traits that they possess? And that requires an erasure, an act of erasure. So that requires claiming that colonial subjects didn't matter to British history, that they were peripheral and insignificant, that they didn't contribute, or even that the process of excluding them didn't matter to the construction of Britishness. So through the act of forgetting the empire, the nation also constructs itself. In Britain, this plays out in a really interesting way, because we have a simultaneous forgetting of empire. So, there's no requirement to teach the history of the empire in school curricula. And at the same time, there's nostalgia for empire, for what we think that it might have meant, for what it seemed to symbolize. And a lot of that has to do with national unity and with a common cause. So that tells us a lot more about the present than it does about the past. Like, what do we think is lacking in the present, and why is that? So all of these play out in very racialized ways that binds together past, present, and future to construct something called the nation.
Thank you for that. Your discussion there brings me back to something that you said during your presentation early on, which was that the Peace Garden that served as one of the 11 sites that you studied. It had fallen into decay, and then it was sort of rejuvenated, and it came to sort of historicize multiculturalism as a British kind of national practice, if you will. So what I found interesting about your analysis of the reason why this Peace Garden was sort of rejuvenated
Mhm.
was that, history here is sort of constructing a particular vision of nationhood that responds to the political conditions today, or the political exigencies, the political needs today. So Britain has to posture as a multicultural nation in the broader context of Brexit, in the broader context of all these violences against asylum seekers, and in the broader context of the war on terror even. And I found it really, really interesting that memory here is being used to construct Britain as multicultural in this particular moment, when it's sort of defending claims that it's regressing towards various forms of exclusionary identities and so on and so forth. So that was really, really, really interesting. Do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, I agree with you when it comes to that. The beginning of the centenary was a really interesting moment. So this was 2014 when it began officially, but decisions were made about how it would be commemorated well before that, pre-Brexit, and in the midst of the coalition government. But Euroscepticism was on the rise, and that became more apparent after the fact when I went back and looked at my notes of what was said, particularly by Cameron, by other political officials during these centennial commemorations. But there was, I would say, a reaction against what was perceived as the dominant narrative of the war. Of mud, blood, and poppies, of what Michael Gove called the Blackadder mentality, but a perception that the war was futile, and that there was no good side or bad side, that it was fundamentally a tragedy. And a concerted effort was made by the state, I would say, to rewrite the narrative of the war as Britain fighting against European tyranny. So that came across in some of the rhetoric of the early commemorations, but one interesting way that it played out was to give more space to Commonwealth citizens. And this was interesting, the word Commonwealth was always used. There was no Commonwealth in 1914, it was an empire, but the word empire was almost never used in the official state commemorations. Commonwealth implied a community of equals bound together by a common history. Mention of the fact that it was an imperial history, but people who share a common history, a common cause, and who unite against other differences, including religion and race and nationality. So it was a very helpful, I would say, narrative amidst Euroscepticism, because the salient other at that point was the EU, was European, and that, again, it wasn't particularly explicit at the beginning, but it was definitely there, particularly in retrospect. So more space was created for colonized subjects, including for Muslims, and they were named. So there were certain Victoria Cross winners, for example, like Khurarat Khan, who were named repeatedly in commemorations. And Baroness Varsi has the phrase that she often repeats, that our boys were not just Tommies, they were Carricks and Tegenders as well. So there's an implication that all of the soldiers united across diverse backgrounds in favor of a common cause. But that cause still had an other. So I think that was the context at the beginning. It did change over the course of the centenary. Obviously, Brexit happened, and then there was a renewed sense of tragedy, and a sense that one of the outcomes of the First World War was a commitment to peace within Europe. The outcome of the two World Wars, rather, was a commitment to peace within Europe, and the EU was fundamental to ensuring that. So there was, in quite a lot of the commemorations, kind of a sense of sadness and uncertainty that pervaded in the later years of the centenary. But another interesting development in the early years was that in 2014, ISIS emerged into the global scene and certainly into media. And actually, as the centenary began in August of 2014. August 4th was when Britain declared war against Germany. So for Britain, it began that day. And there were lots of large-scale national commemorations marking the centenary of the onset of the war. A few weeks later, the first YouTube video of an ISIS execution went viral. And you could see the narrative change at that moment. So suddenly, yes, Muslim soldiers in the First World War were important, but they were juxtaposed with people fighting for ISIS. And so there was this very clear sense of good Muslim, bad Muslim, and a sense that to prove that they belonged, to prove that they were worthy of Britishness, this was the model that Muslims should emulate, being good soldiers, military service, as if it was a binaristic choice. With no in between. So that really raised the stakes for national memory. It raised the prominence of Muslims, but in a way that was nominally positive, talking about heroic Muslim soldiers of the First World War centenary, but with the implication that these were the stakes for inclusion in the British nation. So that was particularly clear in 2014 and 15, when these words of heroism, sacrifice, courage predominated in representations of Muslim soldiers. So there's a lot more that I think could be said about about how representations changed over the course of the centenary. 4 years is a long time, and those particular 4 years were a very long time in British politics, and in France as well.
But I remember that example. Yeah, I totally remember that example from the book about the good Muslim soldier who fought on Britain's side and sort of being juxtaposed to, the not good Muslim soldier. And that sort of makes me think about how memory can be drawn on as a way of sort of producing these regulatory constructs. So nation is no longer a category, right? If we start thinking then with some of Foucault's work, it's not this empty category that's sort of just like filled and it's reified. And of course, I'm not saying that you're saying that, but sometimes the general kind of perception of nation is that it's this fixed entity, but it also does work, it acts like a regulatory construct that is actively sort of constituting subjects. So not only is this discourse of what is Britishness, what is British nationhood, producing nation, but it's also producing subjects that sort of are interpolated by those discourses, and they become, committed and invested in sort of trying to be a part of the national fabric. And so this yields what we call also in the literature the politics of belonging. And this is something that I worked with initially in my own PhD work. This politics in which people produce themselves, position themselves in relation to nation, and this is all being constituted by broader nationalist discourses and how individuals are being positioned within that. And you spoke of the poppy hijab in your book, and I was really intrigued by the poppy hijab. And I know this was something that you made in reference, but do you think you could talk about the poppy hijab and how that sort of fits in terms of contestation? Because your book was very much concerned about exposing the malleableness of the borders of nation, and you identify the narratives that try to contest nation. So would you be able to say some remarks on contestation and the poppy hijab and how that all fits together?
It's a really interesting example, isn't it? And that's one of the cases that I came across late in my research, and I wish that I could have done justice to it and paid greater attention to it. In part because it was developed by a woman, Binda Kausar Ishak, a London fashion student, and it was developed for women as well. And the vast majority of these commemorations are very masculine in character. The vast majority of people I interviewed were men. And the memory of war in general foregrounds the experiences of men. So one of the commitments of the First World War centenary on a larger scale was to discuss the experiences of women during the war more, and that did happen. Overwhelmingly, it was white metropolitan British women who were discussed. But the poppy hijab is a particularly interesting example for that reason, because it contradicts the idea of who remembers, who participates in these formal rituals of remembrance, who's likely to wear a poppy. So the poppy hijab, as I mentioned, was created by Binda Kausar Ishak, and she did so in order to create a way for Muslim women to participate in commemorations that was uniquely their own. So it was a really interesting innovation because in many ways, it drew from dominant narratives of belonging. Like the poppy has lots of mixed associations, let's say. It's seen by many as a celebration of war. It's seen by others as an acknowledgement of the violence of war or a personal connection. It's there are variations: white poppies, purple poppies, black poppies. Now you can get a poppy onesie or poppy slippers. But a poppy hijab was something different because it challenged that understanding of who remembers and to whom these symbols belong. At the same time, it was criticized for succumbing to those dominant symbols. So for not challenging the idea of what the First World War signified and of what it would mean to remember it in a way that was authentic. And instead, it seemed like it was creating a way for Muslim women to conform to those narratives. And it wouldn't be fair to put all of that onto Binda as as being responsible for creating new narratives of the war. But I do think that the poppy hijab is interesting because it's a site of memory in its own right. It's an act of commemoration, and it's one that many who are committed to the dominant narrative actually find threatening because it lays claim to the nation. So it's an interesting one, and I wish that I could have interviewed her for the book because I'd love to unpack her own thoughts, and I don't want to speak for her in terms of her motives for creating it, but it did pop up in a number of commemorations, namely one in Manchester called Stories of Sacrifice, that is particularly interesting because that exhibition didn't just talk about the history of the First World War and Muslims in the First World War, but also about acts of commemoration. So there's a mannequin wearing a poppy hijab in that exhibition. I'm not aware whether the poppy hijab has survived the centenary. I've never seen one in public, I have to say. But it is interesting to see how much interest it generated and controversy actually it generated.
I think what's so fascinating about the poppy hijab, and you're absolutely right, I haven't seen it at all since I've come to the UK, but maybe I wasn't paying attention, is that it makes the body a site of memory. The body. So, and this becomes interesting because now you have nationhood sort of being embodied, and there's this idea of embodiment of belonging, and then it's done through a sartorial form that is racialized to exclude from nation, but then that very form that is the site of exclusion becomes a site of contestation. And then a side of memory. So there's just so much happening there that it would be a whole study on its own.
It would. Maybe
there's something I want to pick up in your accounts that you've been giving us here tonight. You've been using words like tragedy and nostalgia, and in your own work or in your book, you were really interested in mourning and melancholia. And for me, these are operating on the register of the affect. And there is an affective turn in in social science research, and I'm just thinking about some of the literature on affect and how affect really is a kind of constitutive tissue in binding nation together and in binding racial constructs and creating hierarchies of humans. So tell us how you used mourning, mobilization, melancholia, whatever you want to start with, and how are those sort of narratives of memory important in your study here?
Right. Okay. Excellent question. I'm glad you asked that because I didn't address it in my initial comments, but it is important to the book. Right. So in the 11 field sites that I identify, I trace 3 narratives of memory that pervade them: mourning, mobilization, and melancholia. I was quite pleased that they ended up being alliterative in the end. Mourning, I argue, is historically the dominant form of remembering the First World War. And so it's ritualized in cemeteries and cenotaphs and in moments of silence. It's participatory, but it's also hierarchical. And it enacts grieving in ways that are remarkably continuous from the end of the First World War to the present. What's changed is who's remembered and who does the remembering. So when people enact a 2-minute silence, they're positioning themselves as the heirs of memory, the heirs of people who died a century earlier, whether or not they have a personal or familial connection to it. They're laying claim to that memory, laying claim to that familial history, even through this act of mourning. Whether or not there's any sadness that's associated with it, although it is remarkable just how effective a silence, a moment of silence can be, or a formal act of mourning, visiting a cemetery can be. So at the national level, mourning is the dominant narrative. It was almost non-existent in the case studies that I examined. And I think there are a lot of reasons for why that is, in part because of the lack of monuments to Muslim soldiers. There are certainly tombstones. There are entire sections of cemeteries in Flanders fields. So they're there to be commemorated. But because these rituals of mourning have been so historically dominated by power, by the state, by people who lay claim to that memory unproblematically and without being challenged for doing so, I think that makes it difficult for Muslims to be foregrounded at sites of mourning. With that said, when they are, it's an act of assimilation. So for example, to lay a poppy on the grave of a Muslim soldier proclaims that soldier deserves to be remembered in the same way as a non-Muslim soldier, as a white British non-Muslim soldier, for example. It's an acknowledgement of their status as a soldier, and it's an expansion of the nation in a sense, because it proclaims that Muslims belong to the nation, but in a very prescribed, programmed way. So this was dominance at the national level, but not at all, really, at the local level. There was only one site of mourning at my field sites, and that was a small military cemetery with a restored kuba in Nogent-sur-Marne, France. The second narrative I call mobilization. And the reason I choose the term mobilization is that it sounds dynamic. It sounds militaristic, but it's also forward-looking. The Woking Peace Garden is a site of mobilization. And these are sites that acknowledge their distance from the past. They acknowledge how much society has changed, and they create new rituals of memory that reflect that. So, for example, celebrating multiculturalism, celebrating British multiculturalism in the present, but also acknowledging that the nation in 1914 was not a celebratory multicultural space, but a very rigid hierarchical empire, even as categories were being blurred and transcended. Sites of mobilization will acknowledge that movement, that distinction, but they'll seek to restore the nation in the present. So the Woking Peace Garden is very much about creating Britishness in the present, and it's a Britishness that is inclusive of Muslims, and that makes greater allowance for a variety of experiences than sites of mourning do. But the ultimate goal is still to restore the nation as a category. And as we discussed earlier, the nation is inherently exclusionary. There is no belonging without unbelonging. And so that raises the question of who is still excluded in these narratives of mobilization. And often it ends up being the case that difficult histories of erasure are themselves erased from sites of mobilization. And the third narrative is melancholia. So Freud, speaking of affect, Freud writes about mourning and melancholia as a binary at the individual level. So mourning for Freud is the act of acknowledging a loss, naming a loss, grieving a loss, and then eventually moving on and healing. And that's when you're allowed to forget, in a sense, after that loss has been acknowledged, grieved, and then healed from. Melancholia doesn't acknowledge the extent of a loss. The melancholic for Freud realizes that something is different, realizes that something has been lost, realizes that things aren't quite right, but can't identify what was lost or what the issue was. And because of that, the melancholic lives in denial, constantly trying to make oneself whole, but is unable to do so because they haven't identified that loss. And so melancholia for Freud is pathological, because it can never be healed from as long as a loss isn't named. Paul Gilroy applies melancholia to the post-colonial society, to post-colonial Britain in particular. And he argues that the empire is a loss that can't be named because most Britons don't realize the extent to which the empire shaped their own identity. And to acknowledge that would destabilize the nation as a whole. And so post-colonial melancholia is this constant inability to make sense of what's been lost, coupled with a sense that society is not quite right, and that migrants of color in particular, people of color, and post-colonial migrants, people of color in particular, are a threat to the nation, that they're making the nation not quite right. So post-colonial melancholia for Gilroy erupts into violence, racialized violence. So I apply that to sites of memory in two ways. The way that Gilroy talks about melancholia, I term latent melancholia, and I argue that that is spatialized in the form of vandalism to sites of memory, or in the form of ruination. Just the inability to make sense of the past in its entirety, or the clash between past and present in a way that's violent and can't be reconciled. Both of those serve to destabilize the nation because they can't be assimilated into a celebratory multicultural narrative. But I also argue that there's something called cultivated melancholia. And these were some of the most challenging sites of memory for me. Two of them were documentaries, so they didn't map onto space, and I think that gave them more freedom. One was a museum exhibition, but cultivated melancholic sites deliberately disrupt the nation by presenting narratives that are oppositional, contradictory, difficult to understand. They might be about imperial violence, for example, and in their very contradiction, they unsettle the nation. Cultivated melancholic narratives also draw attention to the gaps of dominant memory. So for example, in David Olusoga's documentary, The World's War, he tells the stories of colonial subjects at war, but he also talks of how they've been forgotten and of how much we still don't know today because it's been erased. And what that documentary leaves you with is a sense not of a reconciled nation, not of a united nation, but of one that is very much still trying to grapple with its past and present. So those are melancholic sites, but I would argue that they're different from latent melancholic sites because they're not pathological. Like this is a disruption that needs to happen in order for healing to take place. So those are the sites that I found challenging, difficult to make sense of, but I think that was exactly the point. They're all about unsettling.
Yeah, that was such a fascinating discussion on melancholia. I think it has a lot of theoretical relevance and sort of explaining nation formation today in this post-Brexit context, especially in the wider context of some of the counter-terror powers that perhaps you're keeping in touch with the new bill that silently allows citizen revocation powers to be deployed. And, that's just one of the sort of arsenals in the counterterrorism powers that allow citizenship to be sort of not just revoked, but suspended and kept in this space of internal exile, as Nisha Kapoor might put it. So I want to go back to mourning, because this reminds me of Judith Butler's work in Precarious Life. Perhaps you've read this work. She has a discussion on mourning and grievability, and how mourning is caught up in our understanding of what life counts as life, what life is worth mourning, what life deserves to be remembered when it's passed away. And in the process of mourning, we also construct what life doesn't count as life, and what life is merely living and never life to begin with. And so it's really important, this idea of memory. It's not just shaping nation, but it's also sort of in the broader register of human ontology, producing which life even can lay claim to a national identity, or the national identity of Britishness, because mourning either gives you permission to lay claim or it doesn't. If you're mourned, then you can lay claim. If you're not mourned, then you can't lay claim. And so I think it's really, really interesting how mourning operates on those different kind of rubrics to produce so many things that tie into the production of nation, national identity, and even, if we zoom out a bit more, civilization, since that's sort of the language that's being used now in relation to, this clash of civilizations of the war on terror. I'm just conscious of the time, and I realize that we've been chatting so much that we haven't actually given a chance to our audience to sort of ask questions if they have any. I'm not quite sure how to get the questions. Do you remember, Megan, how?
I think the chat might be open on YouTube.
Okay, right. So
It's open. We can continue chatting.
Do you know how to access our own?
I'm afraid that if I do, I will maybe if I do it on a different device, but it might, I don't know, disrupt the recording.
Okay.
But I'm comfortable with technology, in case you can tell.
I wouldn't know how to do that, actually.
Yeah.
So
I believe that the organizer said that we wouldn't have a chance to take questions from the audience. If anyone's watching, I am happy to take your questions on Twitter. At Megan E. Tinsley, by email. You can find me on the Manchester website. But yeah, looking forward to those questions too. In the meantime, I really appreciate your comments, Amina, about mourning and about Butler's analysis of it. And it reminds me of another aspect of the data that I didn't touch on in my presentation, which is the ways in which soldiers were buried. The First World War democratized mourning in a sense, because this was the first time that non-commissioned officers, private soldiers, were buried in individual marked graves rather than mass graves. And in the British case, families were prohibited from repatriating the bodies. That wasn't the case in France, and that wasn't the case for many others. But that created inequality too, because families with resources to transport bodies were no longer able to, bring the graves, bring the caskets to their own cemeteries. So that creates a hierarchy, an equality in death. And yet, when I mentioned the martial racist ideology earlier, a lot of those who fought and died were not soldiers, and therefore they weren't entitled to remembrance in the same way, and this was racialized. So recently, David Lammy hosted a documentary called The Unremembered, where he, alongside a historian, uncovered that First World War soldiers who were civilian workers, both civilian workers and First World War soldiers who fought in sub-Saharan Africa, were not buried according to Commonwealth War Graves Commission regulations. And then in fact, the graves were racially segregated, and the white British soldiers had individual tombs, whereas the African troops were buried outside of the cemetery gates in unmarked graves. And the scale of this is still being uncovered, but a lot of these burial sites have had structures built on top of them. They're certainly not named. And this is a huge part of the problem, is that when names of individuals weren't noted, when they weren't seen as individuals who were worthy of individual identities and certainly grievable bodies, then that had material implications for how they're remembered a century later. So that these questions are very salient when it comes to the memory of war, and they're really ongoing as well, because the Commonwealth War Graves Commission still exists and it still maintains graves, and so if some graves are being maintained while others have been completely overgrown, then this has implications for who belongs to the nation in the present.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think we could have this conversation for another half hour.
Yes, I didn't realize what time it was until.
But I think we've journeyed through a lot of really important concepts of how nation is produced, different sites of memory, different sites of contestation, and I think our audience is going to have a more robust understanding of how how Britishism is constructed in these kinds of rituals that we sort of don't necessarily see as sites of nation making. But thank you so much then, Dr. Megan Tinsley, for your participation in today's discussion. And if you have any final comments to make, you're more than welcome to make them.
Well, thank you so much, Amina, for your wonderful questions. They're very provocative and they make me want to write another book or an epilogue. I suppose that what I would say in closing is that the centenary ended in 2018, but the questions that it raised are very much ongoing. And I think there's a broader understanding now that memory matters than there was a few years ago. Now statues are being contested and toppled. There's a recognition that sometimes an act of memory is an act of forgetting, an act of erasure. And at the same time, we're seeing bills rushed through Parliament to defend statues, not my term, but to make cultural activism punishable by custodial sentences. So in response, I would just highlight that memory is an ongoing dynamic process, and that sometimes to topple a statue is an act of remembrance too. So my thoughts on how memory is produced and why it's produced and who produces it isn't just really about the First World War centenary, but I hope that these conversations will continue to take place and that people will continue to engage critically and actively with past and present.
Yes, absolutely. I think you've given us a lot of theoretical tools to help make sense of our present. So thank you again for your contribution tonight, and I thank the audience as well for tuning in, and watch out for all our events that we have lined up for the rest of this month, and we will be seeing you again at our next webinar. So take care for now. And
thank you, everyone.
Okay, bye, Megan. Thank you very much.
Thanks.